Lieutenant Marcus Thompson walked through the naval base with his chest puffed out and his jaw set in a hard line. At 28, he had earned his rank through dedication and hard work. But somewhere along the way, he had also developed an attitude that made him difficult to work with. His fellow officers often whispered behind his back about his short temper and his tendency to look down on anyone he considered beneath him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds as Marcus made his way to the equipment storage facility. He had been assigned to oversee the distribution of gear for the upcoming training exercise, and he was already annoyed about having to deal with what he assumed would be lazy enlisted personnel trying to slack off. As he approached the storage building, he noticed a figure in standard Navy fatigue struggling with a heavy crate near the loading dock. The person was smaller in stature, with their back turned to him, and appeared to be having difficulty moving the equipment. Marcus felt his irritation spike immediately. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked as he strode over. The figure straightened up and turned around, revealing a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her uniform was neat and proper, but Marcus barely noticed. All he saw was someone he perceived as weak and incompetent. Petty Officer Sarah Chen had been working since dawn, preparing equipment for the special operations training that was scheduled to begin later that week. She had volunteered for the extra duty because she knew how important proper preparation was for mission success. When she heard the lieutenant's harsh tone, she straightened her shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. "Sir, I'm organizing the equipment for next week's training exercise," Sarah replied calmly, her voice steady despite the obvious hostility in his tone. "The manifest calls for this gear to be sorted by team designation, and I was ensuring everything is accounted for." Marcus stepped closer, his face reddening with anger. He didn't like her calm response, and he certainly didn't appreciate what he interpreted as a lack of proper deference. In his mind, she should have been more apologetic, more submissive in the face of his authority. "Did I ask for your life story, sailor?" he snapped. "I asked what you were doing struggling with equipment like some amateur. Are you even qualified to handle this gear, or did they just stick you here because they didn't know what else to do with you?" Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. She had dealt with officers like this before. Men who assumed that because she was a woman, she was automatically less capable than her male counterparts. She had learned long ago that responding with emotion would only make things worse. "Sir, I am fully qualified to handle this equipment," she said, her voice remaining level. "I have the proper certifications and training. I was simply taking extra care to ensure everything is properly secured for transport." But Marcus wasn't listening to her words. He was too caught up in his own anger and frustration. The stress of recent evaluations, combined with pressure from his superiors about an upcoming promotion board, had left him on edge. He was looking for someone to take his frustrations out on, and this enlisted woman seemed like an easy target. "Extra care?" he laughed mockingly. "It looks to me like you're wasting time and making excuses for your own weakness. Maybe if you spent less time making explanations and more time actually doing your job, we wouldn't have this problem." The other personnel in the area began to take notice of the confrontation. Several sailors working nearby slowed their activities. Sensing the tension building between the lieutenant and the petty officer, some exchanged concerned glances, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond normal military correction. Sarah could feel the eyes of her fellow sailors on her, and she knew that how she handled this moment would be remembered. She had worked too hard to earn the respect of her peers to let this officer's unprofessional behavior undermine her position. She also knew that losing her temper would only give him more ammunition to use against her. "Sir, I understand your concerns about efficiency," she said carefully. "If you would prefer me to prioritize speed over thoroughness, I can adjust my approach accordingly. However, I want to ensure that our personnel receive properly inspected equipment for their safety." This reasonable response only seemed to infuriate Marcus further. He interpreted her measured words as subtle defiance, and his anger reached a boiling point. The pressure he had been under, combined with his natural tendency toward aggression, overwhelmed his judgment. "Are you questioning my priorities?" he demanded, stepping even closer to her. "Are you suggesting that I don't care about personnel safety? Because that's what it sounds like to me, and I don't appreciate the implication." Sarah could see that rational conversation was no longer possible. The lieutenant's face was flushed with anger, and she could practically feel the hostility radiating from him. She took a small step back, not out of fear, but to create some space and hopefully de-escalate the situation. "No, sir, that's not what I meant at all," she said firmly, but respectfully. "I was simply explaining my methodology. I apologize if my words were unclear." But her attempt at de-escalation came too late. Marcus was beyond reason now, his anger having taken complete control of his actions. Without warning, his hand shot out and struck her across the face with a sharp slap that echoed across the loading dock. The sound seemed to freeze everyone in the immediate area. Sarah's head snapped to the side from the impact, but she remained standing, her hand instinctively moving to her cheek where a red mark was already beginning to form. The other sailors who witnessed the incident stood in shocked silence, unable to believe what they had just seen. Marcus himself seemed stunned by his own actions. For a brief moment the anger cleared from his eyes and he realized what he had done, but his pride quickly reasserted itself, and instead of apologizing, he doubled down on his aggression. "That's what happens when you disrespect an officer," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held moments before. "Maybe now you'll remember your place and show proper respect." Sarah slowly turned her head back to face him, her dark eyes now blazing with a controlled fury that made Marcus unconsciously take a step back. The calm, professional demeanor she had maintained was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something that suggested this young petty officer was far more than she appeared to be. The silence that followed the slap stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hand still pressed to her reddening cheek while Marcus tried to maintain his authoritative stance despite the growing unease in his stomach. The other sailors in the area had stopped their work entirely, creating an audience that neither participant had wanted. Sarah's mind raced through her options. Every fiber of her being wanted to respond to the assault with the skill she had spent years perfecting, but she also knew that revealing her true capabilities would compromise not only her current assignment, but potentially years of careful preparation. She forced herself to breathe slowly and think strategically rather than emotionally. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice carrying a dangerous undertone that Marcus was too agitated to recognize, "I believe this situation has gotten out of hand. Perhaps we should report this incident to the appropriate authorities, so it can be handled through proper channels." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine at her words, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down now. He had committed himself to this course of action, and admitting fault would mean acknowledging that he had lost control and struck an enlisted sailor without justification. The implications for his career would be devastating. "There's nothing to report," he said firmly, though sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. "You were being insubordinate, and I corrected the situation. That's how the chain of command works. If you don't like it, maybe you should consider whether the Navy is the right place for someone with your attitude." Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez had been working in the adjacent building when he heard the commotion. As a seasoned sailor with over 15 years of service, he had developed an instinct for when situations were going wrong. The unnatural quiet from the loading dock had drawn his attention, and he approached just in time to witness the aftermath of the confrontation. Rodriguez knew both individuals involved, though in very different capacities. Lieutenant Thompson had a reputation among the enlisted ranks as someone who was difficult to work with and prone to outbursts. Sarah Chen, on the other hand, was known as one of the most professional and capable sailors on the base, though few people knew the full extent of her background and qualifications. "Is everything all right over here?" Rodriguez asked as he approached, his experienced eyes quickly taking in the scene. He noticed the red mark on Sarah's face, the defensive posture of the lieutenant, and the uncomfortable expressions of the other sailors who had witnessed whatever had transpired. Marcus turned toward the chief, grateful for what he hoped would be support from another authority figure. "Just a minor disciplinary issue, Chief. Nothing that can't be handled at this level." But Rodriguez wasn't buying the lieutenant's casual explanation. He had seen enough confrontations over the years to recognize when someone was trying to cover up their own misconduct. The evidence was written clearly on Sarah's face and in the body language of everyone present. "Petty Officer Chen," Rodriguez said formally, "would you mind explaining what happened here?" Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She could report the assault and pursue formal charges, which would likely result in significant consequences for the lieutenant, but would also draw unwanted attention to herself. Alternatively, she could downplay the incident and handle it through other means, though that option carried its own risks. The lieutenant and I had a disagreement about equipment handling procedures, she said carefully. The situation became heated and physical contact occurred. I believe it would be appropriate to document the incident and allow the chain of command to determine the proper response. Her diplomatic phrasing didn't fool Rodriguez for a second. He had been in the Navy long enough to read between the lines, and he knew that physical contact occurred was military speak for an officer struck an enlisted sailor. His face hardened as he processed the implications. Marcus sensed that the situation was slipping away from him. The arrival of the chief had changed the dynamic, and he could see that his version of events wasn't going to be accepted without question. He decided to go on the offensive, hoping to intimidate both Sarah and Rodriguez into dropping the matter. "I think you're making this into something bigger than it needs to be," he said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "Accidents happen during heated discussions. I'm sure Petty Officer Chen understands that sometimes tempers flare in high-stress situations. There's no need to make a federal case out of a minor misunderstanding." But his words had the opposite effect. Rodriguez's expression darkened further, and even some of the observing sailors began to murmur among themselves. Everyone could see that the lieutenant was trying to minimize what had clearly been an inappropriate use of force against a subordinate. Sarah made her decision. While she couldn't reveal her true identity or capabilities, she also couldn't allow this officer's behavior to go unchallenged. Too many good sailors had suffered under commanders who abused their authority, and she had sworn an oath to protect and defend that extended beyond foreign enemies. "Chief Rodriguez," she said formally, "I respectfully request that this incident be documented and reported through the appropriate channels. I believe Lieutenant Thompson's actions constitute assault on a subordinate, and I am prepared to provide a full statement of the events that occurred." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He realized that his attempt to intimidate his way out of the situation had failed completely, and now he was facing the very real possibility of formal charges. His mind raced through the potential consequences: a court-martial, the end of his career, criminal charges, and the complete destruction of everything he had worked to achieve. "You're making a mistake," he said desperately, his earlier authority crumbling into pleading. "This is a misunderstanding that can be resolved between us. There's no need to involve higher authorities in what amounts to a personality conflict." But it was too late. Rodriguez had already made up his mind about what needed to happen next. He had seen too many good sailors suffer under poor leadership, and he wasn't about to let this incident slide just because it involved an officer. "Lieutenant Thompson," Rodriguez said formally, "I am placing you on administrative leave pending an investigation into this incident. You will report to Commander Harrison's office at 800 hours tomorrow morning. Until then, you are not to have any contact with Petty Officer Chen or any of the personnel who witnessed this altercation." Marcus felt the world spinning around him as the reality of his situation sank in. His career, his reputation, his future, everything was now hanging in the balance because of a moment of anger that had lasted less than a second. He looked around at the faces surrounding him and saw only judgment and disapproval. As Rodriguez began organizing the witnesses and preparing to file the necessary reports, Sarah quietly returned to her work organizing the equipment, but her mind wasn't focused on the crates and gear anymore. She was thinking about the larger implications of what had just occurred and the delicate balance she would need to maintain in the days ahead. Commander Sarah Harrison sat behind her desk reviewing the incident report that had been placed before her an hour earlier. As the base's executive officer, she had seen her share of disciplinary problems, but allegations of an officer striking an enlisted sailor always demanded her immediate and serious attention. The paperwork painted a clear picture of an escalating confrontation that had ended with Lieutenant Thompson losing control and assaulting Petty Officer Chen. What made this case particularly interesting to Commander Harrison was her familiarity with both individuals involved, though for very different reasons. Lieutenant Thompson had appeared on her radar several times over the past year due to complaints about his leadership style and treatment of subordinates. While none of the previous incidents had risen to the level of formal charges, they had established a pattern of behavior that concerned his superiors. Petty Officer Chen, on the other hand, was known to Commander Harrison through entirely different channels. As one of the few officers on the base with the security clearance necessary to know about certain special operations personnel, Harrison was well aware that Sarah Chen was not simply another enlisted sailor. The young woman's file contained information that would have shocked Lieutenant Thompson had he been authorized to see it. The morning sun streamed through the commander's office windows as she prepared for what would undoubtedly be a difficult series of meetings. The investigation into the incident would need to be thorough and fair, but it would also need to be conducted in a way that protected classified information and operational security. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Chief Rodriguez entered, followed by Lieutenant Thompson, who looked like he hadn't slept much the previous night. The young officer's usual confidence had been replaced by barely concealed anxiety, and his military bearing seemed forced rather than natural. "Sir, reporting as ordered," Lieutenant Thompson said, his voice tight with tension as he stood at attention before the commander's desk. Commander Harrison studied him for a moment before speaking. "At ease, Lieutenant. Please have a seat." She gestured to the chairs arranged in front of her desk. "Chief Rodriguez, thank you for bringing Lieutenant Thompson. Please remain for this discussion." As they settled into their seats, the commander opened the file on her desk and reviewed the key points once more. The witness statements all corroborated the same basic sequence of events, and the physical evidence in the form of the mark on Petty Officer Chen's face left little room for alternative interpretations. "Lieutenant Thompson," she began formally, "I've reviewed the incident report filed yesterday regarding your interaction with Petty Officer Chen. Before we proceed, I want to give you an opportunity to provide your version of events. Please walk me through what happened from your perspective." Marcus had spent the entire night rehearsing his explanation, trying to find a way to present his actions in the most favorable light possible. He had convinced himself that if he could just explain the stress he had been under and the pressure he was facing, his superiors would understand that his reaction had been an aberration rather than a reflection of his true character. "Commander, I want to start by acknowledging that the situation got out of hand," he began, trying to strike a tone that was both contrite and defensive. "I had been dealing with significant pressure regarding the upcoming promotion board and some challenges in my current assignment. When I encountered what appeared to be inefficiency in the equipment preparation, I became frustrated." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "Petty Officer Chen seemed to be struggling with her assigned tasks, and when I attempted to provide guidance, she responded in a way that I interpreted as disrespectful. I admit that I let my emotions get the better of me, and I made physical contact that was inappropriate. However, I want to emphasize that this was completely out of character for me, and I deeply regret that it occurred." Commander Harrison listened without interruption, her expression remaining neutral throughout his explanation. Chief Rodriguez sat quietly beside him, but his body language clearly indicated his opinion of the lieutenant's account. When Marcus finished speaking, the room fell silent for several moments. "Lieutenant, you described making physical contact with Petty Officer Chen," the commander said finally. "Can you be more specific about the nature of that contact?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had hoped that his euphemistic language would be accepted without further scrutiny, but he could see that the commander was not going to let him minimize the seriousness of his actions. "I struck her across the face with my hand," he admitted reluctantly. "It was a momentary loss of control, and I immediately regretted it." "You slapped a subordinate sailor across the face during what should have been a routine equipment inspection," Commander Harrison stated flatly. "Is that an accurate summary of your actions?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The commander made a note in the file before looking up at him again. "Lieutenant, I need you to understand the gravity of what you've admitted to. Striking a subordinate is not merely a disciplinary issue. It's a criminal act that violates both military law and civilian statutes. The fact that you were under stress does not excuse or mitigate the assault of a fellow service member." Marcus felt his stomach drop as the full implications of his situation became clear. He had hoped that his admission of guilt, combined with his expression of regret, would lead to some form of administrative punishment that would allow him to move forward with his career. Instead, he was beginning to realize that his future in the military was in serious jeopardy. "Commander, I understand that my actions were inappropriate," he said desperately. "I'm prepared to accept whatever punishment is deemed appropriate, and I'm committed to ensuring that nothing like this ever happens again. I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with Petty Officer Chen personally to apologize for my behavior and to make amends for what occurred." That will not be happening, Commander Harrison replied firmly. You are prohibited from having any contact with Petty Officer Chen or any of the witnesses while this investigation is ongoing. Any attempt to influence their testimony or interfere with the process will result in additional charges being filed against you. Chief Rodriguez spoke up for the first time since entering the room. Commander, if I may add something to the record. This is not the first complaint I've received about Lieutenant Thompson's treatment of enlisted personnel. While the previous incidents didn't rise to this level, there has been a pattern of behavior that suggests this assault was not as out of character as he claims. The revelation hit Marcus like another blow. He had assumed that his previous conflicts with subordinates had been forgotten or overlooked, but now it appeared that his superiors had been keeping track of his behavior all along. The pattern that Chief Rodriguez described would make it much more difficult to argue that his assault on Petty Officer Chen had been an isolated incident. Commander Harrison nodded grimly. Thank you, Chief. That information will be included in the investigation file. She turned back to Marcus. Lieutenant Thompson, you are hereby suspended from all duties pending the completion of this investigation. You will remain on base and available for questioning, but you are not to enter any work areas or interact with personnel involved in this case. As the meeting concluded and Marcus was escorted from the office, Commander Harrison was already planning her next conversation. She needed to speak with Petty Officer Chen, but that discussion would require a completely different approach due to the unique circumstances surrounding the young woman's true identity and mission. Later that afternoon, Commander Harrison arranged for a private meeting with Petty Officer Chen in a secure conference room. The location was carefully chosen. It was one of the few spaces on the base that was cleared for classified discussions and protected from electronic surveillance. The commander knew that this conversation would need to address not only the incident with Lieutenant Thompson, but also the broader implications for ongoing special operations. Sarah entered the conference room precisely at the appointed time, her uniform immaculate and her bearing professional despite the events of the previous day. The bruise on her face had darkened overnight, serving as a visible reminder of the assault, but her demeanor remained calm and controlled. Please have a seat, Petty Officer Chen, Commander Harrison said, gesturing to a chair across from her. Before we begin, I want you to know that this conversation is being conducted under the highest security protocols. We can speak freely about all aspects of your situation here. Sarah nodded, understanding the commander's meaning immediately. For the past 18 months, she had been operating under deep cover as part of a joint Navy SEAL and intelligence operation designed to identify security vulnerabilities within routine military operations. Her assignment required her to maintain the appearance of being an ordinary enlisted sailor while secretly observing and reporting on various aspects of base operations. Ma'am, I appreciate the secure environment, Sarah replied. I assume you want to discuss both the immediate incident and the potential impact on my current assignment. Commander Harrison opened a classified file that contained Sarah's actual service record and mission parameters. The document painted a picture that would have astonished anyone who knew her only as Petty Officer Chen. She was actually Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a decorated Navy SEAL with multiple combat deployments and specialized training in counterintelligence operations. Your mission briefing emphasized the importance of maintaining your cover identity, the commander began. How do you assess the current situation in terms of operational security? Sarah had been considering this question since the moment Lieutenant Thompson had struck her. The incident had drawn unwanted attention to her, and the formal investigation would subject her background to scrutiny that could potentially compromise her mission. However, she also recognized that allowing the assault to go unreported would have sent a dangerous message about acceptable behavior toward enlisted personnel. The situation is manageable but requires careful handling, Sarah responded. The incident has made me more visible than ideal, but backing down from formal charges would have undermined my credibility with the enlisted sailors I've been monitoring. Many of them are watching to see whether the system protects them from officer misconduct. Commander Harrison nodded approvingly. One of the skills that made Sarah effective in special operations was her ability to think strategically about complex situations while maintaining her emotional equilibrium. The commander had read her previous mission reports and knew that Sarah possessed exceptional judgment even under pressure. What's your assessment of Lieutenant Thompson? the commander asked. Is his behavior pattern consistent with the types of leadership failures your mission was designed to identify? This question struck at the heart of Sarah's assignment. She had been tasked with identifying officers whose behavior posed risks to unit cohesion, operational effectiveness, and personnel retention. Lieutenant Thompson's conduct represented exactly the kind of toxic leadership that could undermine military readiness and damage the careers of promising young sailors. Lieutenant Thompson exhibits several red flags, Sarah replied professionally. His treatment of subordinates is consistently unprofessional, and he shows clear signs of believing that his rank entitles him to abuse his authority. Yesterday's assault was an extreme manifestation of behavior patterns I've observed over several months. She paused, organizing her thoughts before continuing. More concerning is his apparent belief that he can intimidate people into accepting his misconduct. That suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of military values and leadership principles that makes him unsuitable for positions of responsibility. Commander Harrison made notes as Sarah spoke, recognizing that this assessment would be valuable for the broader evaluation of officer development programs. The intelligence gathered during Sarah's assignment would help identify systemic issues that needed to be addressed to prevent future problems. How do you want to proceed with the investigation? The commander asked. We need to balance the requirements of military justice with the protection of your operational status. Sarah had already developed a strategy for managing this challenge. Her extensive training in covert operations had prepared her for situations where she needed to navigate complex bureaucratic processes while protecting classified information. The key was to participate fully in the investigation while ensuring that her true qualifications never became relevant to the proceedings. I recommend proceeding with the investigation exactly as if I were any other enlisted sailor, she said. My testimony will focus strictly on Lieutenant Thompson's actions and their impact on unit discipline and morale. There's no reason for anyone to dig into my background beyond standard verification of my identity and assignment. The approach made sense to Commander Harrison. By treating Sarah as a typical victim of officer misconduct, they could ensure that justice was served while avoiding any complications related to her special operations background. The investigation would focus on Lieutenant Thompson's behavior, rather than the circumstances of his victim. What about your mission timeline? The commander asked. Will this incident affect your ability to complete your assigned objectives? Sarah had been scheduled to conclude her undercover assignment within the next 2 months, after which she would return to her regular SEAL duties and prepare for her next deployment. The incident with Lieutenant Thompson had accelerated certain aspects of her intelligence gathering, providing clear evidence of the leadership problems she had been tasked to identify. I believe I can complete my primary objectives within the original time frame, she responded. This incident has actually provided valuable data about how the command structure responds to serious misconduct. Observing the investigation process will give me additional insights into systemic strengths and weaknesses. Commander Harrison was impressed by Sarah's ability to find operational value, even in a situation that could have derailed her mission entirely. It was exactly the kind of adaptability and professionalism that made Navy SEALs effective in complex environments where circumstances could change rapidly. There's one more issue we need to address, the commander said. Lieutenant Thompson has requested permission to apologize to you directly. Obviously, we can't allow that while the investigation is ongoing, but I wanted to get your thoughts on how to handle his attempts at damage control. Sarah's expression hardened slightly. She had dealt with enough bullies and abusers during her career to recognize the pattern of behavior that typically followed their exposure. Lieutenant Thompson's desire to apologize directly was likely motivated more by self-preservation than genuine remorse, and allowing him to manipulate the situation would only enable future misconduct. Any direct contact would be inappropriate, she said firmly. His request suggests that he still doesn't understand the seriousness of what he did. A true leader would focus on accepting responsibility and ensuring that justice is served, not on managing his reputation or minimizing consequences. The meeting concluded with both women confident that they had developed a strategy that would serve the interests of justice while protecting operational security. As Sarah prepared to return to her regular duties, she reflected on the irony of her situation. Lieutenant Thompson had assaulted someone he perceived as weak and vulnerable, never realizing that his victim was actually one of the most elite warriors in the entire military. 3 days after the incident, the formal investigation was in full swing. Commander Harrison had assembled a team of investigators from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and they had been interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence to build a comprehensive case. The process was thorough and methodical, leaving no doubt that the military justice system was taking the assault seriously. Lieutenant Thompson spent his days in a state of growing anxiety. Confined to his quarters except for meals and required meetings with investigators, he had hired a military defense attorney, but even his lawyer had been blunt about the challenges they faced. With multiple witnesses and physical evidence of the assault, building a defense would be extremely difficult. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her regular duties while providing testimony and evidence as requested by the investigators. Her fellow sailors had rallied around her with surprising solidarity, and many had expressed their appreciation that she had chosen to pursue formal charges rather than letting the incident slide. The response had provided valuable insights into enlisted morale and attitudes toward leadership accountability. On Thursday morning, an unexpected development changed the entire dynamic of the situation. A group of 3 senior officers arrived at the base unannounced, their arrival marked by the kind of security protocols that suggested their visit was related to highly classified matters. Commander Harrison received word that she was to report immediately to a secure briefing room for an emergency meeting. Captain Robert Hayes, the base commanding officer, was already waiting when Commander Harrison arrived. With him were 2 officers she didn't recognize, though their bearing and the specialized insignia on their uniforms suggested they were involved in special operations or intelligence work. The atmosphere in the room was tense and serious. "Commander Harrison," Captain Hayes began without preamble, "we have a situation that requires immediate attention. These gentlemen are from Naval Special Warfare Command, and they have some information that affects your current investigation." Commander Jake Sullivan, one of the visiting officers, stepped forward with a classified file. His weathered face and multiple combat ribbons indicated extensive experience in dangerous operations, and his presence suggested that Sarah's mission had attracted attention from the highest levels of the special operations community. "Ma'am, we understand you're investigating an assault involving Petty Officer Sarah Chen," Sullivan said. "What you may not know is that Chen is actually Lieutenant Chen, one of our most decorated Navy SEALs currently operating under deep cover on a classified mission." The revelation sent a shock through the room, though Commander Harrison maintained her professional composure, while inwardly noting the careful orchestration of this surprise disclosure. The timing and manner of the revelation had been calculated to maximize its impact on the investigation and ensure that Sarah's true identity became part of the official record. "The implications of this situation extend far beyond a simple assault case," Sullivan continued. "Lieutenant Chen has been conducting a counterintelligence operation designed to identify security vulnerabilities in routine military operations. Her mission required maintaining absolute secrecy about her true qualifications and background." Captain Hayes looked stunned by this information. As the base commanding officer, he had not been briefed on the operation, which was typical for deep cover missions where operational security required limiting the number of people with knowledge of the agent's true identity. The discovery that one of his officers had assaulted a Navy SEAL would have serious implications for his command. "What does this mean for the investigation?" Commander Harrison asked, though she already knew the answer. "It means that Lieutenant Thompson didn't just assault a subordinate sailor," the second visiting officer, Commander Patricia Walsh, replied grimly. "He assaulted one of the most elite warriors in the United States military, someone who could have neutralized him instantly, but chose to maintain her cover and handle the situation through proper channels." The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone in the room. Lieutenant Thompson had struck someone he perceived as weak and defenseless, never realizing that his victim possessed skills and training that far exceeded his own. Sarah's restraint in not revealing her capabilities or retaliating had demonstrated a level of professionalism that made Thompson's behavior appear even more egregious by comparison. "What are Lieutenant Chen's recommendations for proceeding?" Captain Hayes asked. Commander Sullivan consulted his notes before responding. Lieutenant Chen has recommended that the investigation continue exactly as planned, with her true identity remaining classified except where absolutely necessary for legal proceedings. She believes that treating this as a standard assault case will provide the most valuable intelligence about how the system responds to officer misconduct. This approach aligned perfectly with the strategy that Commander Harrison and Sarah had developed during their private meeting. By maintaining the appearance that Sarah was an ordinary enlisted sailor, they could ensure that justice was served based on Lieutenant Thompson's actions rather than on the status of his victim. However, Commander Walsh added, there are additional considerations that need to be addressed. Lieutenant Chen's mission has provided valuable intelligence about leadership problems within the officer corps. Lieutenant Thompson represents exactly the type of toxic leadership that her operation was designed to identify and root out. Captain Hayes nodded grimly. The implications for his command were becoming clear. Not only had one of his officers committed assault, but that officer had been identified through a special operations mission as an example of the kind of leader who posed a threat to military effectiveness and personnel welfare. What's our timeline for resolving this situation? The captain asked. Lieutenant Chen's cover assignment concludes in 6 weeks, Sullivan replied. That gives us time to complete the investigation, pursue appropriate charges against Lieutenant Thompson, and implement any recommended changes to leadership development and oversight protocols. Commander Harrison raised an important procedural question. How do we handle Lieutenant Chen's testimony if her true qualifications become relevant to the case? Her training and experience could be significant factors in evaluating her responses to the assault. That's been considered, Commander Walsh responded. If necessary, portions of her testimony can be given in closed session with appropriate security clearances. However, we believe that her professional handling of the situation speaks for itself regardless of her background. As the meeting continued, the participants developed a comprehensive plan for managing both the immediate legal case and the broader implications for base operations. The assault had inadvertently exposed systemic leadership problems that would require ongoing attention and reform efforts. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Thompson remained unaware of the true identity of the woman he had struck. His defense strategy continued to focus on minimizing the severity of his actions and emphasizing his previous service record. He had no idea that his victim was someone whose own service record included multiple combat deployments and decorations for valor that far exceeded anything in his own file. The irony of his situation would soon become apparent, but for now, he continued to see himself as the victim of an overreaction to what he still considered a minor incident. His inability to recognize the seriousness of his actions and their implications for his career demonstrated exactly the kind of attitude problems that Sarah's mission had been designed to identify. As the day concluded, all parties involved understood that they were dealing with a case that would have implications far beyond the specific incident between Lieutenant Thompson and Petty Officer Chen. The assault had become a catalyst for examining broader questions about leadership, accountability, and the systems in place to protect military personnel from abuse of authority. The court-martial proceedings began on a crisp Monday morning 2 weeks after the incident. The military courtroom was filled with personnel from various ranks and departments, all drawn by the unusual nature of the case and its implications for military justice. Lieutenant Thompson sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, looking pale and anxious as the gravity of his situation became increasingly apparent. The prosecution, led by Major Jennifer Martinez, had built a comprehensive case around the witness testimony and physical evidence. The proceedings began with opening statements that laid out a clear narrative of an officer who had lost control and assaulted a subordinate without justification. The prosecutor's presentation was methodical and professional, focusing on the facts rather than inflammatory rhetoric. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, Major Martinez began, addressing the panel of officers who would determine Lieutenant Thompson's fate. This case is about the fundamental principles that govern military service. It's about the trust that must exist between officers and enlisted personnel, and what happens when that trust is violated through an unprovoked assault. Lieutenant Thompson's defense attorney, Captain David Morrison, faced the challenging task of explaining his client's actions without condoning them. His strategy focused on presenting the assault as an aberration caused by external pressures rather than a reflection of his client's character. However, the evidence and witness testimony made this approach extremely difficult to sustain. The first day of testimony featured several sailors who had witnessed the incident. Their accounts were consistent and damaging, painting a picture of an officer who had escalated a routine interaction into a violent confrontation. Chief Rodriguez provided particularly compelling testimony about the pattern of complaints he had received regarding Lieutenant Thompson's treatment of subordinates. "In my 15 years of service," Chief Rodriguez testified, "I've seen officers make mistakes and lose their temper, but I've never before witnessed an officer strike an enlisted sailor during a non-combat situation. The incident shocked everyone present because it violated every principle of military leadership we're taught to respect." On the second day, Sarah took the stand to provide her testimony. She appeared in her dress uniform with the bruise still visible on her face, serving as a stark reminder of the physical assault that had brought them all together. Her composure and professionalism immediately impressed the court, and her testimony was delivered with clarity and precision. "Petty Officer Chen," Major Martinez began, "please tell the court about your interaction with Lieutenant Thompson on the morning in question." Sarah recounted the events in detail, describing how a routine equipment inspection had escalated into an increasingly hostile confrontation. Her testimony was factual and unemotional, focusing on Lieutenant Thompson's behavior and statements rather than her own feelings about the incident. "Did you at any point behave in a manner that could be considered disrespectful or insubordinate?" the prosecutor asked. "No, ma'am," Sarah replied firmly. "I maintained military courtesy throughout the interaction and attempted to de-escalate the situation when it became clear that Lieutenant Thompson was becoming agitated. I offered to adjust my procedures to meet his preferences and apologized when he suggested that my words had been inappropriate." Captain Morrison's cross-examination attempted to suggest that Sarah had somehow provoked the assault through subtle defiance or disrespect. However, his questions only served to highlight her professionalism and restraint in the face of escalating aggression from a superior officer. "Petty Officer Chen, isn't it true that you questioned Lieutenant Thompson's priorities regarding personnel safety?" Morrison asked, trying to establish some justification for his client's reaction. "No, sir," Sarah responded calmly. "I explained my methodology for equipment preparation and emphasized my concern for personnel safety. At no point did I question the lieutenant's priorities or suggest that he was wrong about anything." The cross-examination continued for nearly an hour, but Captain Morrison was unable to shake Sarah's testimony or establish any reasonable justification for the assault. Her calm, professional responses only made Lieutenant Thompson's behavior appear more inexcusable by comparison. During a recess, Captain Morrison approached his client with growing concern about their chances for acquittal. The witness testimony had been devastating, and Sarah's performance on the stand had eliminated any possibility of claiming that she had somehow provoked the attack. "Marcus, we need to seriously consider a plea agreement," Morrison said quietly. "The prosecution has a strong case, and your chances of being acquitted are minimal. Major Martinez has indicated that she might be willing to negotiate if you're prepared to accept responsibility and express genuine remorse." Lieutenant Thompson had been clinging to the hope that he could somehow escape serious consequences, but the reality of his situation was finally beginning to penetrate his denial. The testimony had made it clear that multiple witnesses had seen him assault a subordinate without justification, and his victim had demonstrated remarkable professionalism in her response. "What kind of deal are they offering?" he asked reluctantly. "Guilty plea to assault, reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and administrative separation from the service," Morrison replied. "It would avoid a felony conviction and prison time, but your military career would be over." The afternoon session resumed with additional testimony from expert witnesses about military leadership principles and the importance of maintaining discipline within the chain of command. A retired colonel who specialized in military justice education explained how officer misconduct could undermine unit cohesion and operational effectiveness when an officer abuses their authority. The expert testified, "It creates a climate of fear and resentment that can persist long after the specific incident has been resolved. Enlisted personnel need to trust that their leaders will protect them, not exploit their vulnerability." As the day concluded, it became apparent that the prosecution had built an overwhelming case. The evidence was clear, the witnesses were credible, and the defendant had no reasonable justification for his actions. Even more damaging was the pattern of previous complaints that suggested the assault was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader problem with Lieutenant Thompson's leadership style. That evening, Lieutenant Thompson met with his attorney to discuss their options. The weight of the evidence against him, combined with the professional manner in which the proceedings had been conducted, had finally broken through his stubborn refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of his situation. "I think I need to accept the plea agreement," he admitted finally. "I can't put myself or anyone else through more of this process when the outcome is already clear." Captain Morrison nodded gravely. "I think that's the right decision. Major Martinez has been fair throughout this process, and the terms she's offering are better than what you would face if you were convicted at trial." Unknown to Lieutenant Thompson, his decision to accept responsibility would soon lead to an even more profound understanding of just how completely he had misjudged the person he had assaulted. The revelation of Sarah's true identity was still to come, and it would provide a final, devastating illustration of how thoroughly his assumptions about strength, weakness, and military capability had been wrong. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following morning. Lieutenant Thompson had spent the entire night wrestling with his decision, finally coming to terms with the reality that his military career was over. The weight of his actions and their consequences had finally penetrated the wall of denial and self-justification he had built around himself. Major Martinez met with Captain Morrison before the hearing to finalize the details of the plea agreement. The terms were straightforward. Lieutenant Thompson would plead guilty to assault, accept reduction to the rank of ensign, forfeit 3 months' pay, and receive an administrative discharge from the Navy. While the consequences were severe, they would allow him to avoid a felony conviction and the possibility of imprisonment. "There is one additional element to this case that your client should be aware of before entering his plea," Major Martinez said to Captain Morrison. "Due to security considerations that have recently come to light, there are aspects of this incident that will be disclosed only after the plea is entered and accepted by the court." Morrison was puzzled by this cryptic statement, but understood that military proceedings sometimes involved classified information that couldn't be discussed during normal legal proceedings. He assured the prosecutor that Lieutenant Thompson was committed to accepting responsibility, regardless of any additional factors that might emerge. The courtroom was packed when the proceedings resumed. Word had spread throughout the base that the case was concluding with a guilty plea, and many personnel were present to witness the resolution of what had become a significant event in the base's recent history. Sarah sat in the gallery, no longer required to testify but present to see the case through to its conclusion. Judge Advocate General Captain Robert Sterling called the court to order and addressed Lieutenant Thompson directly. "Lieutenant, I understand that you wish to enter a guilty plea to the charge of assault." "Is this correct?" "Yes, sir," Thompson replied, his voice barely audible. "Have you discussed this decision with your attorney, and do you understand the consequences of pleading guilty?" "Yes, sir, I have and I do." "Very well. Please state your plea." Lieutenant Thompson took a deep breath before responding. "Your Honor, I plead guilty to the charge of assault against Petty Officer Sarah Chen. I accept full responsibility for my actions and deeply regret the harm I caused." Captain Sterling accepted the plea and began the sentencing phase of the proceedings. Before pronouncing sentence, however, he made an unusual announcement that surprised everyone present except for a few senior officers who had been briefed on the classified aspects of the case. Before imposing sentence, the judge said, "There are additional facts about this case that need to be disclosed for the record. Due to national security considerations, these facts were not previously revealed during the proceedings." Lieutenant Thompson looked confused, wondering what additional information could possibly be relevant to his assault of an enlisted sailor. His attorney was equally puzzled, having seen nothing in the case files that suggested classified implications. Commander Jake Sullivan, who had been present throughout the proceedings as an observer, stepped forward at the judge's invitation. He carried a sealed envelope containing documentation that would transform everyone's understanding of what had really occurred during the incident at the equipment storage facility. "Your Honor," Sullivan began formally, The individual known during these proceedings as Petty Officer Sarah Chen is actually Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a decorated Navy SEAL currently assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command. At the time of the assault, she was operating under deep cover as part of a classified counterintelligence operation. The announcement sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Lieutenant Thompson felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of this revelation began to sink in. He had not simply assaulted a subordinate sailor. He had assaulted one of the most elite warriors in the entire military. Lieutenant Chen, Sullivan continued, reading from her actual service record, has completed multiple combat deployments with SEAL Team 6, has been awarded the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Combat 5, and the Purple Heart. She is qualified in advanced combat tactics, weapon systems, and hand-to-hand combat techniques. The irony of the situation was overwhelming. Lieutenant Thompson had struck someone who possessed the skills to neutralize him instantly, but who had chosen instead to maintain her cover and handled the situation through proper military channels. Her restraint and professionalism had been extraordinary, especially considering her capabilities. Captain Sterling addressed the courtroom's stunned silence. Lieutenant Chen's true identity was classified for operational security reasons, but the facts are now being disclosed because they are relevant to understanding the full implications of the defendant's actions. Sarah was asked to step forward, and for the first time since the incident began, she was introduced by her actual rank and qualifications. The transformation was remarkable. While she had always carried herself with quiet confidence, the revelation of her true status cast her behavior throughout the proceedings in an entirely new light. "Lieutenant Thompson," Captain Sterling said, turning his attention back to the defendant, "you assaulted not just a fellow service member, but one of our nation's most decorated special operations warriors. The fact that Lieutenant Chen could have defended herself but chose not to reveal her capabilities demonstrates a level of professionalism that makes your behavior even more inexcusable." The judge proceeded with the sentencing, imposing the terms that had been agreed upon in the plea bargain. Lieutenant Thompson was reduced to the rank of ensign, forfeited 3 months' pay, and received an administrative discharge. However, the revelation of Sarah's true identity had transformed what might have been seen as a standard assault case into something far more significant. "Let this case serve as a reminder," Captain Sterling concluded, "that leadership is about more than rank or position. True strength is demonstrated through restraint, professionalism, and respect for others, qualities that Lieutenant Chen displayed throughout this ordeal, and qualities that you failed to demonstrate." After the proceedings concluded, Lieutenant Thompson sat in stunned silence as the full weight of what he had done crashed down upon him. He had built his career on assumptions about strength, authority, and military hierarchy, only to discover that his victim possessed qualifications and experience that far exceeded his own. Sarah approached him as the courtroom emptied, offering a gesture that demonstrated the same professionalism she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "Marcus," she said quietly, using his first name for the first time, "I hope you can learn from this experience and find a way to move forward positively." Her words contained no malice or satisfaction, only a genuine hope that he could grow from the consequences of his actions. It was a final demonstration of the leadership, qualities he had failed to display, the ability to maintain dignity and compassion even toward someone who had wronged her. Lieutenant Thompson looked into her eyes and saw not the weakness he had assumed was there, but the quiet strength of someone who had faced far greater challenges than anything he could imagine. His assumptions about her, about himself, and about what constituted real strength had been completely shattered. "I'm sorry," he said simply, meaning it for the first time since the incident had occurred. "I was wrong about everything." Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his apology and walked away, returning to her duties with the same quiet professionalism that had defined her throughout the entire ordeal. For Lieutenant Thompson, his military career was over, but perhaps his education about leadership, respect, and true strength was just beginning.